Okay, hello Bio, this is Mr. B, and we are starting a new chapter with this video. This is chapter 11, and it is titled Introduction to Genetics. So we're going to talk about what genetics is. That's going to be one of the first things that we're going to discuss. And hopefully we've heard this term before, but if not, then just pay attention and we'll figure it out together here. So our first section in chapter 11 is titled The Work of Gregor Mendel. So this name right here is going to be very important. So you need to know Gregor Mendel because he is kind of the father of everything we know about genetics, meaning that he is the one that kind of discovered a majority of what we know today to be true about genetics. So getting into this section, genetics is defined as the scientific study of heredity. So what this means is genetics is the study of how things are passed on from generation to generation, basically. So why you look like your parents, or why you don't look like your parents, or why we have certain traits and things like that. So that's what genetics is the scientific study of heredity. And just some background on Gregor Mendel. He was an Austrian monk, not an Australian monk, an Austrian monk. And I think we talked about this earlier in the year that at the time monks were the church was kind of the center of the scientific world. So monks were going to be the ones that were in charge of what's going on, and they were the only ones that really had access to any of the scientific equipment and things like that. And so that's why Gregor Mendel, that's why him being a monk was important to him understanding heredity. And he carried out all of his work with ordinary garden peas. So that is another important thing we're going to need to know, is that he carried out his work with ordinary garden peas. And so some background information on what Mendel knew. So he knew the male part of each flower produces pollen, which contains sperm, and he knew the female part of the flower produced eggs. So that's just some basic botany there. So that's what he knew about those pea plants. And another thing that he knew is during sexual reproduction, sperm and egg cells join in a process called fertilization. And fertilization is going to produce a new cell. So that's what he knew so far, and this is more things that he knew. So he knew that pea flowers are self-pollinating, and that just means our next point here is that sperm cells and pollen fertilize the eggs in the same flower. So they don't need to go out and find a mate, if you will. They just basically mate with themselves. The sperm and eggs are all produced in the same flower. And the seeds that are produced by self-pollination inherit all of their characteristics from the single plant that bore them. And that means that if I was a pea plant and I just would breed with myself, then I would have basically my own. I would just make a copy of myself. That's what's going on here. And that's all that it's saying, is that the parent is identical to the child, basically, in plant terms. And so Mendel, he also had true breeding pea plants that, if allowed to self-pollinate, would produce offspring identical to themselves. So true breeding is going to be a term we're going to hear a lot, so make sure you know that. And that's just saying that, again, they're producing offspring identical to themselves. However, Mendel wanted to produce seeds by joining male and female reproductive cells from two different plants. And so he, setting up his experiment here, going back to our first couple chapters, he cut away the pollen-bearing male parts of the plant, and dusted the plant's flowers with pollen from another plant. So he didn't allow the plants to self-pollinate like we talked about. And so this process is called cross-pollination. So you can see here, he's taking the pollen from one plant and putting it on the egg of another plant. So he was able to produce seeds that had two different parents. And this is going to be very important here. So cross-pollination is going to be another important factor. And so that was all the work that Mendel did. That's basically his experiment, was he took some pea plants and he basically cross-pollinated them. He took them and mated them with separate plants, which usually what they don't do. So getting into kind of the results of what he found, came up with what is called as a trait. So a trait is a specific characteristic that varies from one individual to another. So when we think of trait, we think of hair color, eye color, height, whether you're left or right-handed, whether you have dimples on your face, things like that. Any of those can be considered a trait. And Mendel, he studied 7 pea plant traits, each with 2 contrasting characters. So that means that we're going to see a chart. So that just means that he had plants that were either short or tall. That's what it means to be contrasting. He had peas that were either green or yellow. They were either wrinkled or smooth. So that's what the contrasting characters were in the pea plants. And he crossed these plants with each of the 7 contrasting characters and studied their offspring. So he wanted to see what happens when you mated a tall plant with a short plant to see if it produces a medium height, tall, or short, or somewhere in between. And when we talk about this, when we talk about our first generation, so each original pair of plants is the pea generation for parental generation. Pretty self-explanatory. So the offspring, so when you take 2 parental or pea generation parents and you put them together, you're going to get the F1 generation. And the offspring of these crosses between parents with different traits are called hybrids. So when you take 2 separate parents, put them together, we get a hybrid as a result. And the F1 hybrid plants all had the character of only one of the parents. So that's saying that when we mix a tall and a short, we didn't get a medium. We either got a tall or we either got a short. So there was those hybrids, they didn't mix. One was kind of dominant over the other, which is kind of going to be what we're going to talk about within the next couple days here. So here's just a picture, kind of some of his different characteristics. We're going to look at all these. So we have seed shape, seed color, seed coat color, pod shape, pod color, flower position, and plant height. Don't memorize these yet. We're going to talk about these more in class. And so his first conclusion after doing his work was that biological inheritance, so that's just the passing on of whether or not you're tall or short, is determined by factors that are passed from one generation to the next. And today, we call these the factors that determine traits genes. So genes is another important word we're going to need to know for this chapter. I think we've all at least been introduced to that before, but now we're going to get more in depth. And each of the traits Mendel studied was controlled by one gene that occurred in 2 contrasting forms that produced different characters for each trait. So that's saying that that one gene would either make us tall or short. That's our contrasting. That one gene would either make you green or yellow. And these different forms of genes are called alleles. So this is another important word, allele. And Mendel's second conclusion after he came up with the first one is that it's called the principle of dominance, which we will get into in our next video. If you have any questions, write them down and let me know.